Alright, so we're back again, part 3, and in this part we're going to be doing two things for the most part. First, foremost, we're going to be finishing the wireframe for the overall vehicle. There will be some added wireframe elements down the line after this part, but for the most part it will be mostly done, and it'll be the skeleton around which the rest of the car is designed around. That's one. Two, which is really going to be the bulk of this episode, if you will. It will actually be the more extensive testing of the surface geometry, which is something you want to do early on. See how the surfaces behave given the curves that you've created, given the guide curves that you created, to make sure that down the line, when you finally finish your full skeleton, you don't have to go back and completely redo everything. You can almost think of this as a proof of concept as far as generative shape design goes, to make sure that what you've done actually works. So, what we're doing right here is mostly just tidying up the back end, getting it to roughly where it should be, geometrically speaking, in space, so that this guide point that you're looking at right now is as close to above the wheel center as possible, which is actually quite easy in this situation, because all you have to do really is, I haven't figured it out yet at the time, but you just have to go back and pull the exact number that you used to center the wheel out of your history, and then copy paste it into whatever dimension that you're manipulating is. But anyways, now we're going to the door, and this is something I wanted to deliberately tread lightly around, if you will. So I'm trying to keep the guide curves separate from when they go into the door area and when they go out of it, because this is something that I'll probably get into around part 5 in this series, if I'm not mistaken. I've recorded about half of this so far, but I have recorded this at the time of doing the voiceover. Okay, something else I want to mention here is when I go into the 3-part view, as you saw towards the beginning of this, I believe this is going to be part 2, or part 3.2, whatever this is going to be labeled on LinkedIn. The reason why I go into that view, I'm just going to speak while I'm working in the background, is because sometimes you need to reference multiple angles at once, and you can't do that when you're looking through one viewport as it is now. When you go into the multi-view setup, it allows you to not only look at each angle that you want it to, that is relevant, but you can also adjust those angles as need be, so you can effectively look at 4 separate viewports at the same time at your specification. But by default, it defaults to top, rear, and right side, if I'm not mistaken. And this is not necessarily something that's essential, but it's incredibly convenient because it just keeps it so that you don't have to keep on switching between different viewports, and it makes it a lot more efficient to make these sort of free-flowing, more organic shapes that don't have specific numbers attached to them at all times. Alright, so I've started to lay down some surfaces, and I'm doing some measurements here. The reason why I'm taking this measurement in particular is to make sure that there's ample clearance between the top of the wheel well and the roof, if you will, of this particular body panel. At this point, I'm also going to go back and forth and make sure that I have enough clearance to satisfy the needs of that particular part, because this isn't just a ethereal shape that we're making here. It's a car. There are pieces and components that have to go inside of this outer shell that we're creating here. There are shocks, there are support struts, there's an engine that has to go into the engine bay. So later down the line, I'm going to bring in a model to make sure that it fits in there. Frankly, I probably should have done it at first, but it's also not something that's relevant per se, because a little bit of a spoiler for later on in the series, I am going to make my own engine. Although I'm not going to say exactly what that engine is per se, because that's proprietary. I'll get into that later. So once again, what we're doing here is we're creating test surfaces and making sure that everything fits where it should, everything is behaving as it should, and making sure that there's no issues with curvature. Like here, it sort of tucks upward again into the body. So I'm just messing around with it here, make sure it's relatively consistent with what it should be. And more importantly, how does the surface that is going to attach to that curve behave when it's brought into the model and you start actually creating these surfaces? Because none of these guide curves matter if you can't actually work with them, and then you can't make the final product that you're trying to make in a GSD sense. And once again, I'm just kind of toying around, seeing what works, see what doesn't work, analyzing behavior, and not necessarily shooting for the final product here, although some of these surfaces may end up in the final product. What I'm doing here is mostly the experimentation I mentioned at the beginning of this part. I'm just seeing, or sort of plug and playing, what happens when I try to make surfaces in this general area. And as you can see here, the front right, or the front leftmost fender of this car is kind of behaving weird. It has a sort of inward fold that I didn't really like. So now what I'm doing is I'm kind of saying, okay, I'm gonna get back to that, and I believe this is the splitter stiffener that I'm making the beginnings of right here, just to get that laid down and really to see what it'll look like. Because as you can see below in the profile drawing, it's not something that I really accounted for, because again, this isn't a strict performance car, and it's not really something I modeled in advance. And again, this is just how I work. This isn't necessarily a word of wisdom per se. This is more so just me playing around and dancing with the idea of this build. And the way that I happen to work is just happens to be a little bit scatterbrained at times. Like if another part is giving me problems, if it's annoying me for whatever reason, I just put a pin in it, go to something else. I'll go back to that original component later. And as so happens, this is actually a fairly good example of a more nuanced demonstration of what you could do with generative shape design. So if I were to just leave the outer edges of this design, it would effectively be a Dorito, or a curved Dorito, or a scale, if you will. But with that middle stiffener, you can give it more accent, more of a profile. And what that allows you to do is specifically control the behavior of that curve, as you can see that I'm doing here. And depending on where I put that middle curve, I can control exactly what the behavior of that profile is. Although, granted, there is a there's the drawing on the way, so it looks very saturated, so it's a little bit hard to see from that angle. And now I'm accounting for the profile of the fender above the splitter. And I think what I was trying to do with that curve was I was trying to build the ramp, if you will, for the air to be carried over. And with this curve, I'm just trying to connect the splitter to the upper clamshell, if you will. But this is something that I'm going to go back and forth on multiple times, so this isn't necessarily indicative of what the final design will look like. Again, this is me sort of playing around with it, toying with it, and really just experimenting, see what I think of the shapes, because this is very much, it's less engineering and much more so art with some consciousness of engineering. Okay, so once again, I'm messing around with the front right fender, and I keep going back and forth with this part largely because, again, it's having some really weird behaviors, as you can see with how the light reflects off of that fender. And I'm just going back and forth thinking, okay, there's got to be a couple of ways I can go about fixing this that take advantage of the tangencies that currently exist with the model and turning it into a more smooth shape. And very importantly, I want to get rid of these folds that have developed. I keep on sidetracking myself to try and iterate the curves on the bottom as well, because I keep thinking that, hey, maybe that'll make this behave in the way that I want it to. Again, this is actually something I struggled with for quite a while in context. And under many circumstances, it would just keep on having that center fold right next to the upper support next to curve 2. And it wasn't until I induced a deviation, which is a slightly more invasive thing that's relatively easy to accommodate for, that it started to behave in the way that it was supposed to. And generally, this is something that one may say you shouldn't do, but in reality, it's just another tool in the toolbox. It's something that has to be accommodated for down the line, but ultimately it's really inevitable that you're going to have to do this for most models. So I don't really see the point in staying away from it. Because in reality, the way that you accommodate for a deviation in a join operation, which you'll always have to do with generative shape design, is you just allow for some tolerance, and you just make sure that whatever deviation you have to have is less than the tolerance that you allow in that final operation. But anyways, we're back to the front lower panel, and what I'm trying to do is continue that gentle curve from the top to the bottom. And I'm having a little bit of trouble here because I hadn't figured out that the lower curve that I use to connect the splitter to the wheel well is too far outward in order to allow for a more gentle curve from top half to bottom half of the hood. And I don't know if I get to it in this part. I don't think I do. But that hump right there, that's what I'm trying to get rid of this whole time. And at this point, I'm kind of going back and forth that, like, is it discreet enough for me to sort of forgive, if you will? Like, is this acceptable? And ultimately, I keep on going back and forth with it because I am thinking to myself, no, this is too extreme. If I'm not mistaken, that bump is somewhere around 2 inches, and it would be noticeable in the final product. So, right now, this is me just going back and forth and trying to find ways to massage it into the shape that I want it to. And again, this is me kind of getting sidetracked and working on the splitter, which granted is something that I need to get to, but it's not exactly the number one thing I should be focusing on. Again, this is just my style of work. Okay, there we go. I figured it out there. So, really the answer to this situation was I was constraining the curve to the wrong points that did not have the flexibility needed to smooth out the overall geometry. So I did start over a little bit early on, but overall, having the point constrained to a different element allowed me to have a little bit more give, if you will, with the space I was playing with. Because in reality, you are playing with millimeters at all times. Most of the time, I should say. And now I'm checking that line with the profile to make sure it's where I want it to be. And I said, okay, that's fine. And now I am making that lower lip to the front grille. That sort of Jaguar-esque look. And what I'm doing here is I'm kind of taking advantage of the resolution of my computer, and you can see the pixelations, how they're sort of stepping downward. When you want to have a gentle curve that very slightly goes in a certain way, you just have to look at a particular angle that is normal to that curve, and it will pixelate upwards when you reach the limit of its concavity. I'm not sure if that's really worth mentioning, but there it is. And now I'm making that sort of lower cheekbone. Kind of going back to the analogy with the model.